My name is Caleb Sterling. I'm 42 years old, and my wife demanded I go to her male best friend's house to apologize for making things weird at a Memorial Day barbecue after he spent the entire night with his hand on the small of her back. She didn't care that I'd been working 80-hour weeks as a cybersecurity architect to keep our family in Myers Park, or that the tension in that backyard was thick enough to choke on. To her, my dignity was a small price to pay for his comfort. She wanted me to walk into Brooks Reed's living room, look him in the eye, and say I was sorry for having boundaries. So, I said okay. I told her I'd handle it. But the folder I carried into his house the next afternoon wasn't filled with an apology. It was a meticulous record of every hotel room, every hidden bank transfer, and the medical paperwork from a procedure she had 4 months ago that was physically impossible for me to have caused. By the time I walked back out of that house, 2 marriages were dead, and the man who thought he was untouchable was staring at the wreckage of a life I had unknowingly been paying for. I remember standing in the kitchen, watching the steam rise from her expensive espresso machine, thinking that as long as I kept working, as long as I kept providing, the cracks in the foundation didn't matter. I honestly believed that if I just swallowed my pride one more time, I could save the only world I knew. I need to ask you something first. Where are you listening from today? Drop your city below, because what I'm about to tell you is something I've never said out loud in Charlotte. The air in our Center Hall Colonial felt heavy that Thursday night, the kind of stillness that precedes a Carolina thunderstorm. I had just finished a 12-hour shift at the financial data center in Uptown, dealing with a ransomware threat that had kept me pinned to a desk since sunrise. I was exhausted, the kind of bone-deep weariness that makes your vision blur at the edges, but as soon as I pulled my Audi into the driveway, I saw the lights were on in the kitchen. My wife, Elena Sterling, was waiting for me. She wasn't making dinner or scrolling through her luxury real estate listings. She was standing by the Marble Island with her arms crossed, her jaw set in that specific way that told me I was already on trial before I even set down my briefcase. "We need to talk," she said, her voice cutting through the hum of the air conditioner before I could even loosen my tie. I stayed by the door, watching her, noticing the way she wore her expensive designer yoga gear like armor. I asked her what was wrong, though I could already feel the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in my chest. She told me that Brooks Reed had called her, that he was deeply upset about what had happened the previous weekend during the cookout at their place in Lake Norman. Brooks Reed had been her closest friend for 6 years, a man who always seemed to be standing just a little too close, laughing just a little too loud at her jokes, and looking at me like I was an obstacle to be managed rather than the man she had sworn to spend her life with. My wife told me I had embarrassed him. She said that when he had hugged her to celebrate a potential new listing commission, I had pulled him aside and said something about boundaries that made him feel attacked. I walked over to the sink and poured a glass of water, trying to keep my hands from shaking. I reminded her that his hand had been on her lower back for at least 10 seconds and that it wasn't a friendly gesture. But she threw up her hands, her voice rising in that sharp, dismissive tone she used whenever I tried to express a feeling she didn't want to hear. She called me paranoid. She said Brooks was just being supportive and that I was the one who made it weird. The conversation shifted then, becoming less about the hug and more about the social fallout. She told me that Brooks's wife, Sophia Reed, had noticed the tension and now things were awkward for everyone in their social circle. My wife stepped toward me, her voice dropping into that controlled, icy register she used when she was delivering an ultimatum. She told me I needed to apologize to him. She said I needed to fix it to show that I respected their friendship. That was the line that changed everything. Our friendship. Not my marriage. Not the 18 years we had spent building a life together in North Carolina. Not the respect I deserved as her husband. She was prioritizing the comfort of a man who looked at her with hunger in his eyes over the dignity of the man who worked himself to exhaustion to pay for her lifestyle. I looked at her then, really looked at her, and I saw the flush in her cheeks and the way she couldn't quite maintain eye contact. I realized then that I had been choosing not to see the truth for a very long time. "All right," I said quietly. The words seemed to hang in the air between us. She blinked, clearly surprised that I wasn't going to fight her on it this time. She asked if I was serious, and I told her I would talk to him. I told her I would clear the air. She smiled then, that radiant, victorious smile that used to make me feel like the luckiest man in the world, and she kissed my cheek before heading upstairs. She had no idea that while she slept, I would be sitting in my home office, watching the red lights of the network router blink in the dark, finally allowing myself to look at the evidence I had been ignoring for months. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my desk and opened the cloud storage account we had linked years ago, a shared digital space she had likely forgotten existed. I started with the phone logs. There were hundreds of texts between them, many sent in the middle of the night while I was sleeping right next to her. I saw the patterns of her late showings in South Park and her weekend seminars in Asheville. I found a photo from 3 months ago, a selfie she had taken in a high-end hotel room with a glass of expensive Napa Cabernet in her hand. The metadata showed it was taken in Atlanta during a weekend she claimed to be visiting her sister. I cross-referenced it with Brooks Reed's public social media. He had checked into a Buckhead steakhouse that same night. By 4 in the morning, I was no longer a husband, I was an investigator. I pulled the bank statements from our joint savings account. I saw the cash withdrawals, $300 here, $500 there, always on the days she was supposedly out with her girlfriends at the country club. I followed the paper trail of a life I didn't recognize, a shadow marriage that had been thriving right under my nose while I was focused on the security of our family. My heart was beating hard in my chest, a dull, rhythmic thud that felt like a warning. I wasn't just angry, I was cold. I felt a clarity I hadn't known in years. I realized that my wife hadn't just been unfaithful, she had been systematic. She had been using the resources I provided to build a sanctuary for another man. I stayed at that desk until the sun began to peek over the tree line of the backyard, documenting every lie, every scent, and every betrayal until I had a folder that was thick enough to bury the woman I thought I knew. The morning light crawled across the white oak floors of my office, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air. It was a beautiful morning in Charlotte, the kind of Saturday that usually meant pancakes on the griddle and talk of driving down to Lake Wylie for the afternoon. I sat there, my eyes burning from the blue light of the monitor, listening to the house wake up. I heard the familiar creak of the floorboards in the hallway, the sound of the shower running in the master suite, and the distant clatter of the Viking range being moved in the kitchen. For a few minutes, if I closed my eyes, I could almost pretend that the folder on my desk didn't exist. I could pretend that the woman I had married 18 years ago was still the same person who had stood with me on the porch of our first tiny bungalow in Dilworth, looking at a fixer-upper and seeing a palace. We had moved to Myers Park because it felt like the ultimate destination. It was the neighborhood of old oaks and winding drives, a place where the houses looked like they had been there forever and the families inside them were supposed to be just as permanent. When we closed on this house in 2014, I remember my wife, my Elena, leaning her head on my shoulder as we stood in the empty foyer. She told me that we had finally made it. She said our kids, Liam and Harper, would grow up with roots that went deep into this North Carolina soil. I had worked myself to the bone to make that dream a reality, taking every promotion, traveling to every data center from Virginia to Florida, all so she could have the life she saw on the pages of those luxury lifestyle magazines. I remember thinking that morning that the hardest part of our life was already behind us. We had the house, the investments, the kids were doing well in their private academies, and we were finally in a position to just breathe. I honestly believed that our biggest worries would be whether the landscaper trimmed the boxwoods correctly or which charity gala we were expected to attend in the fall. I walked downstairs around 7:30, my movements stiff and robotic. The smell of Starbucks breakfast blend was already heavy in the kitchen, a scent that had always meant home to me, but now felt like a clinical observation of a routine. My wife was there, her hair pulled back in a perfect, effortless knot, her Lululemon leggings making her look like she hadn't aged a day since our wedding. She was humming a song I didn't recognize, something light and airy, as she moved between the Sub-Zero refrigerator and the marble countertops. She looked up when I entered, her expression bright and untroubled. "You're up early," she said, her voice warm, as if we hadn't spent the previous night discussing my public humiliation. She poured me a mug of coffee and pushed it toward me. "I was thinking we could take the Audi out to the Arboretum later. The weather is going to be perfect." I looked at her, and for a split second, I saw the woman I had fallen in love with at UNC. I saw the girl who used to split a $10 pizza with me while we studied for finals, the one who cried when we bought our first used SUV. I kept telling myself it was fine, that I was reading too much into things, that maybe the texts were just a misunderstanding I was blowing out of proportion. And I think most of us know that feeling, when you already know the truth, but you need just one more day to pretend you don't. It's that desperate, quiet hope that if you don't say the words out loud, the world won't actually break. She started talking about a new listing she had in South Park, a $5 million estate with a private vineyard, and how she thought Brooks might have a client interested in it. She said his name so casually, with a familiarity that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just a business contact, it was a name that sat comfortably in her life, a name that she expected me to accept as part of our shared landscape. She talked about the commission, the remodeling they were doing at the Lake Norman house, and how she was so glad I was going to apologize to him because it would make the summer so much easier for the kids. I watched her hands as she moved. They were steady, there was no tremor of guilt, no hesitation in her eyes. It was a masterclass in normalcy. I realized then that her ability to lie wasn't a sudden development, it was a skill she had been honing for years. While I was focused on firewalls and server encryption, she had been building an entire life in the shadows, a life funded by the inheritance my parents had left me 8 years ago. I had kept that money in VH Investments, a firm I'd managed quietly, intending it to be a safety net for Liam and Harper. I hadn't hidden it from her out of malice. I just never felt the need to brag about it. But sitting there in the kitchen, watching her sip her coffee, I wondered how much of that safety net she had already started to dismantle. "When are you going to see him?" she asked, leaning against the counter. "I told Sophia you'd probably drop by this afternoon. She's hosting a small luncheon for the art gallery board, so Brooks will be home in his office." "I'll go at 2, I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, flat, devoid of the warmth I usually had when I spoke to her. "I've got some paperwork to finish up first." "Good," she said, walking over and brushing her hand against my arm. It was a gesture of affection she had used 1,000 times, but this time I felt the urge to pull away. "I'm proud of you, Caleb. It takes a big man to admit when he's wrong. This is going to be a fresh start for all of us." She left a few minutes later, heading to her Saturday yoga session at a studio in Dilworth. I stood at the window and watched her SUV disappear down Providence Road, the red taillights fading into the morning traffic. The house was quiet then, save for the distant sound of Liam playing video games in the basement. I walked back to my office and looked at the folder. I thought about the fresh start she wanted. She wanted a version of our life where I was neutered, where I accepted her best friend as a permanent fixture in our home, and where she could continue her double life without the inconvenience of my suspicion. I spent the next few hours making phone calls. I called Gerald, the man who had managed VH Investments for a decade. I asked for a full audit of every account I had. I needed to know exactly how much of my life was still mine. I thought about the early years again, about how we used to talk about the future while sitting on the floor of our first apartment. We didn't have much then, but we had a sense of shared purpose. We were a team. I wondered at what point she had decided to play for a different side, or if she had ever really been on mine to begin with. I remember thinking, if I sign these papers, if I go through with this divorce, it's over. Not just the marriage, the whole world I built. Every memory, every holiday, every photograph on the wall becomes a lie. But as I looked out at the perfectly manicured lawn and the quiet, wealthy street, I realized the lie was already there. I was just the last person to acknowledge it. The fresh start wasn't something she was offering me. It was something I was going to have to take for myself, one piece of evidence at a time. I waited until the house was completely empty, the kind of heavy silence that only exists in a large home when the life has been pulled out of it. Liam had taken the Jeep to meet friends at the South Park Mall, and my daughter was upstairs with her noise-canceling headphones, lost in a world that I hoped was kinder than the one I was currently dismantling. I went into the home office and sat at the mahogany desk, pulling her laptop toward me. She always left it unlocked, a sign of either supreme confidence or a complete lack of respect for my intelligence. I opened her email first, scrolling past the hundreds of luxury listing alerts and the correspondence with closing attorneys in Mecklenburg County. Deep in a subfolder labeled Marketing Assets 2023, I found what I was looking for. There was a series of confirmation emails for a trip to Seattle that past October. She had called me from the Pacific Northwest that Friday night, just to tell me she missed the kids, her voice sounding small and tired, like she was truly exhausted from a long day of real estate seminars. I told her I loved her and to get some sleep. I think she was already opening the champagne. I clicked on the PDF attachment for the Four Seasons booking. It wasn't for a single occupant. It was for 2 guests, a king-sized bed, and an anniversary package that included a chilled bottle of Veuve Clicquot and a late checkout. My heart didn't race this time. It just slowed down, a heavy, sinking weight in my chest as I stared at the screen. I remember thinking, she's not even trying to hide it from herself. She's keeping these records like trophies of a life she thinks she's earned. I kept waiting for a reason to be wrong. I thought, there has to be a client, a logic, a paper trail that doesn't lead back to him. I was looking for a ghost of my own making. I moved on to the digital files in her cloud storage, searching for any mention of VH Investments. My parents had left me $2.5 million when they passed away in Raleigh, a legacy of textile mill success and decades of disciplined saving. I had put that money into a holding company to ensure our kids would never have to worry about college tuition or their first home down payment. I had trusted the woman I married to respect that legacy. But then I found the ledger. She had been tracking the performance of VH Investments for years. She knew every penny that was in those accounts. And then I saw it, a series of transfers to a company called Reed Development Group. I recognized the name immediately. It was the firm where her best friend, Brooks Reed, served as the principal partner. My own inheritance, the money my father had spent 40 years earning in the heat of a factory, had been used to keep the lovers' business afloat during a high-interest rate slump in the Charlotte market. She hadn't just been giving him her time and her body. She had been siphoning off my children's future to make sure he could keep his Lake Norman lifestyle. I sat there in the dark, watching the cursor blink, realizing that the woman I loved had become a stranger who was using my own sweat and blood to fund her escape. You know what? Caleb just stood there holding that paper. You've been through things. You know what it feels like when family turns on you. What would you tell him right now? Drop it below. Because what she did next surprised even me. I felt a surge of nausea as I realized the depth of the irony. Every time we went out to dinner with the Reeds, every time Brooks would order the most expensive bottle of bourbon on the menu and slap me on the back, I was the one paying for it. I was subsidizing the man who was systematically destroying my home. I took out my phone and began photographing every screen, every transfer, every time-stamped email that proved they weren't just having an affair, they were running a financial operation. I went deeper into her private notes, a digital diary she kept on an encrypted drive that I bypassed in under 5 minutes using a decryption script I'd written for work. The entries were short, clinical, and devastating. She wrote about how I was too busy with the servers to notice what she was doing. She wrote about how Brooks made her feel alive again, a phrase that sounded like a cliché until you realized it was being used to justify the theft of a family's security. But the entry that broke me was from 8 months ago. She had written about a complication that they had handled at a private clinic in Asheville. She had gone through an abortion without ever mentioning a pregnancy to me. I had undergone a vasectomy after our daughter was born, a decision we made together in a doctor's office on Park Road. We had held hands and talked about how our family was perfect exactly as it was. That child could never have been mine. She had carried a secret life inside her, literally, and then erased it without a word, all while coming home to me and asking how my day at the data center was. I sat there in the silence of my Myers Park office, the folder growing heavier with every page I printed. I wasn't just looking at an affair anymore. I was looking at the total erasure of the man I used to be. The house was so quiet I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer, a heavy, mechanical heartbeat that seemed to be counting down the final hours of my life as I knew it. I stepped out of the office, the folder tucked under my arm like a lead weight, and walked toward the stairs. The sun was hitting the stained glass window on the landing, throwing fractured patterns of amber and deep blue across the carpet. It was a beautiful afternoon in Charlotte, the kind of day that usually smelled like freshly cut grass and charcoal grills, but inside these walls, the air felt thin and cold. I found my daughter, Harper Sterling, sitting on the window seat in her room, staring out at the ancient oaks that lined our street. She was 14, at that delicate age where the world starts to lose its soft edges, and she looked smaller than she had a year ago. She didn't have her headphones on. She was just sitting there, her hands folded in her lap, waiting for something she couldn't name. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the way the light caught the gold in her hair, and I felt a surge of protectiveness so sharp it made my throat ache. "Hey, sweetheart," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't jump. She just turned her head slowly, her eyes searching mine with a level of intensity that no child should have to possess. I sat down on the edge of her bed, the quilt beneath me feeling familiar and grounded. I asked her if she was okay, and for a long time she didn't answer. She just looked back out the window at the suburban quiet. "Dad," she said finally, her voice small and trembling. "Is Mom ever coming back from yoga?" I realized then that she wasn't asking about the exercise class. She was asking if the version of our family that she understood was already gone. I reached out and took her hand. It was cold, despite the Carolina heat outside. I told her that I was working on some things, that I was trying to make sure everything was going to be okay. But I could see the skepticism in her eyes, the way she was already calculating the distance between my words and the reality she had been observing in the hallways of our home. She started talking then, the words spilling out of her like a dam finally breaking. She told me about the afternoon last month when I was in Seattle for the cybersecurity summit. She had come home early from her tutor's house because she'd forgotten her laptop charger. She said there was a car in the driveway she didn't recognize, a black Range Rover that didn't belong to any of our neighbors. When she walked into the kitchen, she saw the woman who raised her standing at the marble island with Brooks Reed. She said they were standing so close that there was no space between them, and the way they looked at each other made her feel like she had walked into a room where she didn't belong. When they heard the door click, they jumped apart, and her mother immediately started talking about a work emergency and market fluctuations in Mecklenburg County. But the girl I had raised wasn't fooled. She told me that the woman who should have protected her from these things made her promise not to tell me. She said it was a surprise they were working on, and that I wouldn't understand. My chest felt like it was being crushed by a vice. I didn't say anything. I just pulled her into a hug, feeling the shudder of her breath against my shoulder. I think every parent has that moment where they realize their child isn't just watching them, they're protecting them. And it's the quietest, most heartbreaking kind of betrayal when you realize they've been carrying a weight that was never meant for their shoulders. That's what you do when you're not ready to blow up a family dinner over something you can't yet prove. You just carry the secret until it starts to change the shape of your soul. I sat there with her for a long time, the shadows lengthening across the floor of her room. I realized that my wife hadn't just betrayed me. She had drafted our daughter into her deception. She had turned our home into a place of whispered secrets and hidden glances, forcing a 14-year-old girl to choose between loyalty to her mother and the truth she owed her father. It was a level of cruelty that I couldn't wrap my head around, a fundamental violation of the safety a home is supposed to provide. "Has she asked you to keep other secrets?" I asked, pulling back to look at her. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. She told me about the packages that would arrive from high-end boutiques in South Park, packages she was told to hide in the back of the master closet before I got home. Her mother told her they were birthday gifts for me, even though my birthday wasn't until December. She told me about the late-night phone calls she overheard from the hallway, conversations full of a kind of laughter she never heard when I was in the room. I felt a cold, clear resolve settling over me. I wasn't just a man with a folder of evidence anymore. I was a father who was watching the light fade from his daughter's eyes because of the choices of the woman who was supposed to be her North Star. I told her that she didn't have to keep those secrets anymore. I told her that none of this was her fault, and that from now on, the truth was the only thing that mattered in this house. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and asked me what was going to happen next. I looked at the folder sitting on the bed beside us, the pages filled with the financial ruin and the moral bankruptcy of the woman who was currently finding her setter in a yoga studio across town. I told her that I was going to have a conversation with the man who had been coming into our home. I told her that things were going to change, but that she and her brother would always have a place where they were safe. I left her room and walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood. I felt like a stranger in my own life, navigating the ruins of a Myers Park dream that had turned into a nightmare. I looked at the family photos lining the wall, the trips to the Outer Banks, the Christmas mornings by the fireplace, the smiles that all looked so genuine in the frames. I wondered how much of it was real and how much of it was just a well-maintained facade for the neighbors. But as I reached the bottom of the stairs, I realized it didn't matter. The facade was coming down, and I was the one who was going to pull the first brick. I walked into our bedroom, where the afternoon sun was filtering through the heavy linen curtains we'd picked out together in High Point 3 years ago. The bed was made, the pillows fluffed, and for a heartbeat, it looked like the sanctuary it was always supposed to be. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have a home that felt this peaceful. But that peace was a lie, a thin layer of latex paint over dry rot. I walked past the king-sized bed, the one I'd paid for with my first senior-level bonus, and went straight to her walk-in closet. I pushed aside the rows of designer dresses and the expensive leather boots she wore to charity events in Uptown, reaching for the back corner behind the heavy winter coats. There, stacked neatly as if they were just seasonal storage, were 3 cardboard shipping boxes. I opened the first one. It was filled with men's clothing, not my clothes, not the cybersecurity branded fleeces or the Target t-shirts I wore on weekends. These were designer silk shirts, a cashmere blazer, and an Italian leather jacket that probably cost more than my first car. Every single item was in a size that would fit a man much broader than me, a man like Brooks Reed. A god stood there, my hands hovering over the soft fabric, feeling a coldness spread through my chest that no North Carolina summer could touch. My wife hadn't just been seeing him, she had been providing for him. She was using our home as a warehouse for a life she was building with someone else. I kept waiting for my brain to find a logical explanation, some scrap of reason that didn't involve the total destruction of my marriage. I kept thinking, maybe these are gods for me that she got the wrong size for. I wanted to believe that lie so badly it made my stomach turn. Then I reached the second box. Underneath a stack of high-end cologne, I found a manila folder from a private medical clinic in Asheville. I ubbed gay, my eyes scanning the clinical G-gay until they landed on a date from 8 months ago. It was a summary for an abortion procedure. My wife, The woman who had sat across from me at dinner every night for 18 years had terminated a pregnancy without ever uttering a word to me. But the part that felt like a physical blow to the rib gay was the emergency contact name listed on the form. Brooks Reed. I felt the room tilt. I had undergone a vasectomy 3 years ago at a urology center on Park Road. We had sat in the waiting room together, laughing about how we were finally done with diapers and midnight feedings. She had drib-gay me home and made me chicken soup. I kept waiting for the words on the page to change into something else. Gee, thought, she knows I can't have children. She knows what we decided drib-gay. The realization was a jagged shard of glass in my throat. The child she had been carrying wasn't just a secret. It was a biological G-gay ability for me. It was his. I have to stop here for a second. Has someone ever taken something from you that wasn't theirs to take? You gay don't have to share the whole story. Just a heart below if you've been there. You are not alone. Because what I found at the bottom of that final box was the end of any hope for a quiet divorce. The final box didn't contain clothes or medical records. It contained the financial blueprints of my own ruin. I found a printed ledger detailing the holdings of VH Investments, my private inheritance fund. The gay were handwritten notes in the margins in my wife's elegant script, calculating the liquidity of my parents' legacy. Next rib-gay notes were bank transfer receipts to Rib-Gay Development Group. She had moved over $40,000 from our joint savings and was already planning how to access the $2 million sitting in my private accounts. She wasn't just having an affair with Brooks Reed. She was siphoning gay fund my family's history to funding her tear it down. I sat on the floor of that closet, surrounded by another man's silk shirts and the proof of a child that would never be born, and I realized that my wife drib-gay she wanted to take everything I had built and hand it to him. I drib-gay money out and photographed every single page, every receipt, and every medical record. My hands were steady now, the heat of the anger replaced by a freezing, crystalline focus. I put drib-gay back exactly as I had found it. I smoothed the winter coats and closed the closet door. I walked downstairs, the weight of the folder in my mind feeling like a weapon. I was finally ready drib-gay. I heard the Audi pull in drib-gay. My wife was back from her yoga class, likely feeling refreshed and centered. I looked out the kitchen window at the perfectly manicured lawn of our Myers Park home and realized that the man who had walked into this drib-gay yesterday was gone. In his place was someone who finally understood the price of an apology. The drive from Myers Park over toward the Reed's residence in the South Park area was only 15 minutes, but it felt like I was crossing an entire lifetime. I drove my Audi slowly, the tires humming against the asphalt of Queens Road West, watching the afternoon sunlight filter through the canopy of old oaks that make this part of Charlotte look so permanent. On any other Saturday, I would have been thinking about the Braves game, or whether I should stop by the Home Depot on South Boulevard for some pine needles to mulch the flower beds before the humidity got too thick. I remember one 4th of July about 3 years ago, just after I'd had the vasectomy. We had all gone down to Lake Norman to watch the fireworks from the back of Brooks Reed's new pontoon boat. My wife had been laughing, her head thrown back, a glass of sweet tea in her hand. And I remember looking at her and thinking that I had finally given her everything she ever wanted. I felt a sense of peace that I can still taste if I try hard enough. A warmth that comes from believing that you are exactly where you are supposed to be, surrounded by the people who define your world. I honestly believed we were the lucky ones. That's the thing about a quiet life. You don't notice the silence is changing until it's too late to speak up. I think many of us have been there, standing in a room that feels safe, not realizing that the floor has already been cut out from under you. You just keep walking because you trust the ground, and you don't look down until you're already falling. It's a slow, steady erosion that you mistake for the natural passage of time. I thought about his wife, Sophia Reed. She was an art gallery curator who lived for the quiet beauty of a canvas. A woman who seemed to carry a natural grace that my wife had started to trade for commission checks and social status. I wondered if Sophia sat in that 5-bedroom house and felt the same cold draft that had been blowing through mine. She had always been kind to my kids, always remembering Harper's love for charcoal sketching and Liam's interest in architecture. She deserved better than a man who used her dignity as a footstool. And she certainly deserved better than a friend who was systematically dismantling her life from the inside. As I pulled onto their street, I noticed the way the azaleas were blooming in the neighbors' yards. Vibrant, temporary bursts of color that would be gone in a few weeks. Everything in this neighborhood was about the appearance of health. The stucco was always clean. The lawns were always a perfect emerald green. And the cars in the driveways always looked like they had just come off the lot. I remember thinking as I put the car in park, I'm not here to destroy a family. I'm just here to stop pretending that one still exists. I sat there for a moment, the engine ticking as it cooled, the folder resting on the passenger seat like a silent witness. I remember thinking that this was the last time I would ever feel like a man who belonged in this world. The next time I turned this key, I would be someone else, a man who had traded his comfort for the truth. I walked up the flagstone path of the Reed residence, the weight of the folder in my hand feeling lighter now that I was finally standing on their doorstep. Before I could even knock, the door swung open. Brooks Reed stood there, wearing a crisp white linen shirt and that practiced, politician smile that had always made me feel like I was being sold something I didn't want. He extended his hand, his grip firm and performative. "Caleb, come on in, man," he said, his voice smooth and welcoming. "Appreciate you coming over to clear the air." I didn't smile back. I just stepped into the foyer, my eyes immediately finding his wife, Sophia Reed. She was sitting on the edge of a tufted velvet sofa in the living room, looking smaller than I remembered, her hands wrapped tightly around a ceramic mug. She gave me a tentative, worried smile. I sat in the chair across from them, setting the manila folder on the reclaimed wood coffee table. Brooke settled next to his wife, draping his arm over the back of the couch in a gesture of ownership that I finally saw for exactly what it was. He started talking about misunderstandings and how we were all adults, but I interrupted him gently. I told them both that I wasn't there about the barbecue. I told them that my wife, Elena, had insisted I apologize for making Brooks uncomfortable and that I figured if I was going to do it, I should do it properly, with full transparency. Stop right here. If you were in my position, lay the truth on the table and watch it burn, or take the easy apology and go back to a comfortable lie. Yes or no below. I want to know. Okay, here's what I actually did. I opened the folder. I started with the text messages, laying them out one by one like a trail of breadcrumbs. I showed them the Seattle hotel receipts, the king-size bed, and the anniversary champagne I'd paid for with our joint account. Brooks's face went from smug to a sickly gray pale. He tried to stand, tried to tell me I had no right to dig into his private business, but I stayed in my seat, my voice eerie and calm as I reminded him that his business, Reed Development Group, was currently being kept afloat by $40,000 of my children's inheritance. I kept thinking, he really believed I was too weak to look. He thought that because I was the guy who fixed the servers, I wouldn't have the stomach to fix my own life. Then I handed the final document directly to Sophia. It was the medical record from the Asheville clinic. I watched her eyes scan the page, watched the moment she saw her husband's name listed as the emergency contact for an abortion procedure. A sound escaped her throat, not a sob, but a sharp, jagged intake of breath that seemed to pull all the oxygen out of the room. She looked at Brooks, and for the first time in 6 years, the charm didn't work. The mask didn't just slip, it shattered. She stood up without a single word and walked upstairs, her footsteps heavy and final on the hardwood. I stood, gathering my empty folder. Brooks looked at me, his jaw working soundlessly, all the South Park polish gone. I told him I was sorry. I told him I was sorry I hadn't seen what he really was sooner, and that I was deeply sorry for what was about to happen to his career. I walked out of that house and drove straight back to Myers Park. When I walked into my kitchen, my wife was standing there, still in her yoga gear, making a pot of herbal tea. She turned with a bright, expectant smile, asking how the apology went. I didn't say a word. I just reached into my pocket and pulled out the remaining copies of the bank transfers and the medical records. I laid them on the marble island. The mug slipped from her hands. It hit the tile floor and shattered, hot tea splashing across her expensive leggings, but she didn't even flinch. She just stood there, frozen, as the world we had built for 18 years finished collapsing around her. I told her I'd already filed for divorce in Mecklenburg County. I told her that Liam and Harper were already packing their bags. Before I tell you what happened to her, what does justice look like to you in a kitchen full of broken glass? Drop it below. Then tell me, was the outcome enough? What came next was something even the closing attorneys didn't see coming. The fallout was clinical and absolute. Within 48 hours, the board at Reed Development Group received a full report on Brooks's financial conduct and the misuse of investor funds, my funds. He was terminated immediately. My wife, the woman who used to grace the covers of local real estate magazines, found herself persona non grata in every luxury firm from here to Raleigh. Her own parents, Judith and Arthur, told her she wasn't welcome in their home until she took accountability for what she'd done to our children. She's living in a one-bedroom apartment in a part of town she used to look down on now, working a retail job at a boutique where she used to be a VIP. Brooks is gone too. Last I heard, he's trying to sell insurance in the suburbs, his Lake Norman lifestyle a distant memory. I think I kept forgiving her for years because I needed to believe that the woman who had known me since college couldn't really want to destroy me. I confused loyalty with safety, and I stayed because I was afraid of the silence that comes after a marriage ends. That was my mistake, not hers. I still drive past the old house in Myers Park sometimes, and I keep going.